Hello, my friends. Stay to the end and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I had been driving for hours through the back roads of Vermont, snow piling up on my windshield wipers, the world outside reduced to an endless white blur. I was heading to a small cabin I had rented for the winter, just me, the mountains, and the promise of solitude. I thought it would be peaceful, a chance to escape the chaos of city life. I didn't know that peace can be a lie and solitude can be a trap. The cabin was even more remote than the listing suggested. There were no neighbors for miles, and the road leading up to it was barely maintained, already slick with ice. When I finally arrived, the place looked abandoned but solid. Stone chimney, thick wooden beams, a fireplace that smelled faintly of soot and pine. The snow outside was pristine, untouched, except for the tracks leading to the front door. I assumed the previous caretaker had been there recently. The first night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every little sound. The wind rattled the shutters, and occasionally a tree branch would scrape against the roof. I slept with the fire crackling, imagining the snow outside insulating me from the world. But when I woke at 3 a.m, something was wrong. The snow outside the window had been disturbed. Footprints led from the tree line to the cabin's porch. They were long, narrow, almost human, but not quite. The spacing was uneven, the impressions too deep in some places, too shallow in others. I stared at them, frozen, heart pounding, before convincing myself it had to be a deer or a large animal. Over the next few days, odd things began to happen. I would put objects down in one place and find them elsewhere. Chairs slightly turned, books open to random pages, small scratches on the wooden floor. At first, I thought it was exhaustion. I was alone, tired from driving and clearing snow. But the feeling of being watched grew heavier with each passing day. I could sense eyes on me, even when no one was there. By the 5th night, the storm hit in full force. Snow whipped against the cabin, and the wind howled like it was alive. I stayed near the fireplace, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, reaching toward me. Around midnight, I heard movement outside, footsteps crunching in the deep snow. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, shining it into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a shadow moved at the tree line. Too tall, too thin to be human. It swayed slightly, almost like it was gliding over the snow. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I saw the tracks again. They had multiplied, circling the cabin, forming patterns in the snow I didn't understand. Loops, spirals, lines intersecting at impossible angles. They led nowhere and everywhere at once, as if whatever was making them had no need to leave. I felt a rising panic, realizing that I was being observed by something that had been learning me for days. On the 7th night, the presence made itself more obvious. I woke to the feeling of someone, or something, standing just outside the bedroom door. I froze, holding my breath. The air in the cabin had grown colder, thick, pressing down on my chest. I dared not move. My flashlight lay on the floor, where I had left it on the dresser. I reached for it slowly, and when I turned it on, the beam caught something at the edge of the hall. A tall, thin figure, faceless, gliding slightly above the floor. I screamed and it vanished. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, felt like movement outside. Shadows danced where none should be. I barricaded the doors and windows, but it didn't matter. Whatever was out there didn't need doors or windows to get in. I began talking to it, pleading, threatening, promising to leave if it would only let me be. It never responded. I knew it could hear me. I knew it was learning me. I tried to leave on the 10th day. I dug my truck out of the snow and tried to start it, but the battery was dead. I checked the cell signal. None. The storm had cut me off completely. I was trapped in the snow with something patient, something watching, something that didn't follow the rules of this world. That night, I saw more figures outside the cabin, 5 of them, maybe more, gliding over the snow in silence. They didn't make footprints. Their forms were featureless, impossibly thin, swaying slightly in unison. I tried to record them on my phone, but the screen went black whenever I pointed it at them. I couldn't escape, couldn't hide. The air seemed heavier, thicker, like the cold had weight. By the 12th night, I was beyond terrified. I barricaded the doors and windows, sitting in the corner of the living room with a fireplace poker in hand. I whispered to them, begged them, told them I would leave if they let me. Nothing. Then I noticed prints inside the cabin, wet and slushy, leading from the back hallway to the living room, then stopping halfway. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't rationalize it. The isolation was no longer peaceful. It was a prison. I finally managed to start the truck the next morning. I drove down the mountain road as fast as I could, snow crunching under the tires. I didn't look back, but I felt it. The presence in the snow, patient and watching. Even now, weeks later, I feel it when the wind whistles through the trees or when snow falls silently outside. Then came the letter. No return address. Inside was a photograph of the cabin at night, windows glowing faintly, snow stretching around it. And in the snow, I could see the figures, tall, thin, faceless, swaying in unison. At the bottom of the photograph, scrawled in jagged black ink, were the words, "We never left." I haven't returned to the mountains. I avoid snow, forests, and isolation whenever possible. But every winter, when the nights grow long and the wind bites at my skin, I feel them again. I know they are out there, waiting. Winter is no longer silent. It watches, it waits, and it does not forgive those who wander alone. I didn't plan on being alone in the mountains that December. I thought I was just escaping the city for a quiet winter, a little cabin tucked deep in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. The owners of the place were friends of a friend, an old family property they left me to maintain while they stayed in Boston. They said it was isolated, perfect for getting away from everything. They didn't warn me about what waited in the snow. The first day, the drive up the winding mountain road was beautiful. Snow covered the pines, the peaks in the distance dusted like icing sugar. The cabin itself was rustic, stone fireplace, wooden beams, high ceilings. But something about it felt off. Not unpleasant exactly, but there was a stillness that didn't belong. The kind of stillness that makes you look over your shoulder, even when you know no one is there. I spent the first evening unpacking, stoking the fire, and wandering around the property. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. The woods behind the cabin stretched for miles, and the snow muffled every sound, turning the world into a quiet, white tomb. I settled into bed that night, feeling like the only living thing in a frozen wilderness. Around midnight, I woke to a sound I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the cabin, but it wasn't outside. It was inside. A soft scratching, like fingernails against wood. My heart thumped as I sat up. The fireplace had died down, leaving the room dim and shadowed. I told myself it was the old cabin settling, but even as I whispered it aloud, I felt eyes on me. The next morning, I found footprints outside the cabin. Long, thin, and uneven. They led from the edge of the forest directly to the porch, stopping short as if whatever had made them had vanished. They weren't human, at least not entirely. The spacing was wrong, the toes too long, the heels too narrow. I photographed them, but deep down I knew no one had walked here. The snow was undisturbed otherwise, no tracks leading away. That night, I stayed awake near the fireplace, glancing out the windows. At one point, I thought I saw a movement, a shadow, too tall to be a person, too thin to be an animal, swaying at the tree line. When I blinked, it was gone. My mind raced with explanations, exhaustion, isolation, stress. But I didn't sleep well. I never felt alone like this before. Over the next few days, the lodge began to feel strange in other ways. Objects moved, My coffee cup would be on the floor, a notebook would open with pages turned. At first, I blamed myself, dropping things, forgetting where I put them. But the feeling persisted that something else was there, unseen, observing. I stopped leaving my bedroom at night unless necessary. I barricaded doors and windows, but the unease only grew. On the sixth night, the storm arrived. The wind slammed against the walls, snowdrifts piling against the windows, and the temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath indoors. I stayed in bed with every light on, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching in the snow just beyond the tree line. I grabbed my coat, flashlight, and a hatchet and ran outside, following the prints, hoping to confront whoever or whatever was out there. The tracks led deep into the woods, farther than I had dared go before. They circled in odd patterns, forming loops, spirals, and other shapes I didn't understand. I felt dizzy, my breath freezing in my throat. Then I saw them. Figures emerging from between the trees, tall, thin, featureless, gliding silently across the snow. Their movements weren't human. They didn't walk. They drifted, floating just above the ground. They stopped as I stumbled forward, observing me with an intensity I couldn't comprehend. I turned and ran back to the cabin, heart hammering, lungs burning. Inside, I barricaded the doors again, the fire roaring as though it could stave off what lurked outside. I didn't sleep that night. Shadows moved at the corners of my vision, stretching unnaturally, elongating toward me. I spoke aloud, pleading, commanding, even threatening. They did not respond. The presence in the cabin was patient, deliberate, pressing against my mind in a way I couldn't shake. The next morning, I found new tracks inside the lodge, wet, slushy footprints leading from the back hallway to the living room, then vanishing as if whoever or whatever made them had dissolved into the floor. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't rationalize it. The isolation that once seemed like paradise had become a prison. Days passed. The storm didn't relent, and I realized I had no choice but to leave. I tried the truck again. It wouldn't start, the battery frozen solid. I called the owners, but the line was dead. Cell service was non-existent. I was trapped, alone, with the figures lurking in the snow outside. On the 10th night, I awoke to a sensation of someone or something standing over me, not touching me, not breathing on me, but present. I opened my eyes. The room was empty. The temperature had dropped sharply. My flashlight lay on the floor where I hadn't left it. My hands shook as I crawled out of bed and tried to light the fireplace, but the match burned briefly and went out, as if swallowed by the cold. I spent the night in the corner of the living room, near the door, clutching the hatchet, staring at the tree line. The shapes appeared just outside, taller than trees in the distance, swaying slightly in unison. I whispered that I would leave if they let me, that I was no threat. But the shapes didn't move. They only watched. By the 12th day, I finally managed to get the truck started. The battery somehow revived in the cold. I left the cabin, snow crunching under the tires, heart racing. I didn't look back. I drove down the mountain road, feeling the forest and the frozen lake recede behind me, but I couldn't escape the memory. The patient, featureless figures, the footprints circling the cabin, the feeling that the cold itself had a mind and a will. Weeks later, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside was a photograph. The lodge at night, windows glowing faintly, snow stretching around it. In the snow, I could make out the figures. Tall, thin, swaying, faceless. At the bottom, written in jagged black ink, were the words, "We never left." I haven't gone north in the winter since. I avoid forests, avoid mountains, avoid solitude in the cold. But every year, when the wind whistles and snow falls silently, I feel them again. The patient watchers waiting. Winter is not silent. It is alive. It watches. It waits. And if you are alone, it will find you. I've always liked the cold. Growing up in Minnesota, winters were long, harsh and merciless, but I found comfort in them. Snow muffled the world, turning it quiet and calm. That is, until last winter, when I realized the quiet can hide things that don't belong, things that wait, patient and relentless in the frost and darkness. I had taken a job as a caretaker for a remote lodge in northern Vermont. The lodge had been abandoned for years, nestled deep in the woods near Lake Willoughby, far from any town or road that was regularly plowed. The owners lived in Boston and only came up for the hunting season, leaving me to maintain the property during the winter months. The solitude sounded perfect. I wanted nothing but isolation, thinking I could finally write without distractions. The first few days were idyllic. The cabin was rustic but sturdy, with a stone fireplace, wooden beams, and a view of snow-covered peaks that stretched as far as the eye could see. I chopped firewood, cleared the driveway, and explored the trails around the property. Everything seemed peaceful, untouched, but even then, there was something wrong. I couldn't place it at first. It was a feeling, a presence, a tension in the air that set my teeth on edge. The first strange sign appeared on my third night. I woke to the sound of snow crunching outside. Through the frost-covered windows, I saw footprints leading from the woods to the cabin. At first glance, I assumed a hunter had wandered by, but the prints were wrong. They were long, narrow, almost humanoid, but not quite. The spacing was uneven, the shape unnatural, and the trail stopped abruptly at the edge of the porch. No return tracks, no path back to the trees. I brushed it off, telling myself it had to be my imagination, or maybe an animal I didn't recognize. But the unease settled in my chest like a stone. That night, I barely slept, checking every window and door multiple times. I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. The following days brought more oddities. Objects in the cabin were moved, chairs slightly askew, a broom knocked over, my notebook scattered across the floor. I live alone normally, and I'm not clumsy, so this unsettled me. I told myself I was imagining things, that isolation was playing tricks on my mind, but the feeling of being observed grew heavier with each passing night. By the sixth day, a blizzard had moved in. The wind howled against the cabin, rattling the shutters, piling snow high against the walls. I stayed near the fireplace, reading and trying to maintain normalcy. Around midnight, I caught a movement in the window, a shadow, taller than any human, standing at the edge of the tree line. I blinked, and it vanished. My rational mind told me it was a trick of the firelight or exhaustion, but my gut knew otherwise. The next morning, the snow surrounding the cabin had changed. New footprints appeared, circling the building, forming loops and strange patterns that made no sense. I traced them with my gloved hands, noting the deliberate, calculated nature of the paths. It was as if someone, or something, was observing me, learning, planning. I tried to leave on the seventh day, but the snow was impassable. My truck wouldn't start, the battery dead in the freezing temperatures. Cell service was non-existent. I realized that I was trapped. The isolation that had once appealed to me now felt suffocating. That night, I awoke to a scraping sound outside the cabin. I held my breath, straining to listen. It was slow, deliberate, like claws against wood. I turned on every light in the cabin, but the darkness outside seemed unaffected. The shadows at the tree line had thickened, darker than they should have been, swaying slightly in unison. By the ninth night, I started seeing the figures more clearly. Tall, thin, featureless, gliding silently over the snow. They didn't walk. They floated, effortlessly, unnaturally. They appeared at the edge of my vision, just beyond the trees, always watching, always patient. I began talking to them, aloud, begging them to leave, demanding they stop. Of course, they didn't respond. I could feel their presence pressing against my mind, studying me, learning my routines. On the 10th day, desperation overcame caution. I decided to follow the tracks leading from the cabin into the forest. I bundled up in every layer I had and stepped into the snow, heart hammering. The footprints led me deep into the woods, farther than I had dared to go before. Then I saw them, clearly now, emerging from between the trees. Their forms were unnervingly tall and thin, faceless, swaying like trees in the wind. They didn't move like animals or humans. They simply existed, silently, impossibly. I ran back to the cabin, tripping and falling in the snow, my lungs burning, tears freezing on my face. Inside, I barricaded every door and window, the fire roaring against the cold that seemed to have grown sentient. That night, I could feel it in the cabin, the cold presence pressing closer, heavier, patient. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, barely daring to breathe. The following days passed in a blur of snow, fear, and exhaustion. I attempted to start the truck again. Miraculously, it worked, and I drove down the mountain road, leaving the lodge behind. The forest receded in my rearview mirror, but the unease never left me. Even weeks later, I could feel the memory of those faceless figures pressing in, patient, waiting. Then came the letter. No return address. Inside was a photograph. The lodge at night, windows glowing faintly, snow stretching around it. In the snow, I could just make out the tall, thin figures. Their forms were unmistakable. At the bottom of the photograph, in jagged black ink, were the words, "We never left." I haven't returned to the lodge. I don't travel north in December anymore. I avoid isolated places, avoid forests and snow. But every winter, when the wind whistles through the trees and snow falls thick and silent, I feel them again. I know they are out there, still patient, still waiting. Winter is not quiet. It is alive. It watches. It waits. And if you are alone, if you stray too far from the warmth, it will find you. I've always loved winter, or at least I thought I did. The crisp air, the soft hush of freshly fallen snow, the way the world seemed to pause. It all felt peaceful. I never imagined that winter could hide something patient, something old, something waiting for people like me. I found out the hard way last year when I took a caretaker job at an abandoned lodge in northern Maine. The lodge sat miles from the nearest town, on a ridge surrounded by dense forests and frozen lakes. The owners had moved out years ago, and the only reason they hired me was to check on the property and ensure it didn't fall into complete disrepair during the harsh months. I didn't mind the isolation. I liked solitude. I thought it would be peaceful. The first few days were exactly that. I chopped firewood, cleared snow from the paths, and explored the area around the lodge. The silence was deep, almost holy, but it also made every movement in the forest feel magnified. The creak of a branch, the snap of ice under a fallen log. I chalked it up to being alone and overthinking. On the third night, I woke to see footprints in the snow outside my window. They weren't human, at least not entirely. They were elongated, narrow, with odd indentations that suggested claws or extra long toes. They led from the woods directly to the cabin's porch and stopped abruptly, as if whatever had made them vanished into the snow itself. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a deer, maybe a hunter, but the pattern was deliberate, almost ritualistic. The next few days brought more unsettling signs. I began noticing small things inside the lodge had moved. A chair would be slightly turned, a pot left on the counter would end up on the floor. I told myself it was exhaustion, the stress of isolation, or maybe I was misplacing things. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. By the sixth night, a storm rolled in, fierce and unrelenting. Snow piled against the windows and doors, and the wind seemed to carry whispers that I couldn't understand. I stayed close to the fireplace, trying to ignore the sounds outside. That night, I saw shadows moving at the edge of the tree line, tall and thin, swaying slightly. I blinked, and they were gone. The following morning, I discovered the snow around the lodge had been disturbed. More elongated tracks, forming loops and circles around the building, appearing overnight. They didn't lead anywhere. They only circled the lodge, as if whatever made them was pacing, watching. I felt an irrational panic, but I forced myself to stay calm and keep to routine. On the 8th day, I decided to take a walk despite the wind. I needed to know what was making those tracks. I followed them into the forest, deeper than I had ventured before. The snow was knee-deep and the trees formed thick walls around me. That's when I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, tall, thin, featureless, gliding over the snow like they were part of it. I froze. They didn't move like humans or animals. They just watched. I ran back to the lodge as fast as I could, slipping and falling in the snow, heart hammering. Inside, I locked every door and window, but I didn't feel safe. The shadows seemed to follow, pressing against the glass, moving just beyond the walls. That night, I barely slept, keeping one eye open and a fire poker in hand. The next morning, I noticed prints inside the lodge, slushy, wet footprints leading from the back hallway to the living room, stopping halfway, as if whoever, or whatever, had been there, vanished into the floor. The doors were all locked. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't rationalize it. I began to feel trapped, like the forest and the snow and the cold were all closing in. Days passed and the snow deepened. My attempts to leave failed. My truck wouldn't start, and there was no cell signal. Isolation was no longer peaceful. It was a prison. I noticed new formations in the snow, shallow depressions arranged in perfect circles, lines intersecting in patterns I couldn't comprehend. The presence outside was deliberate, patient, almost intelligent. On the 12th night, I awoke to the feeling of someone, or something, standing over me. Not touching me, not breathing on me, but present. I opened my eyes. The room was empty, but the temperature dropped sharply. The warmth from the fireplace sucked away like a vacuum. My flashlight, which I had left on the dresser, lay on the floor. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The following morning, I tried the truck again. Miraculously, it started, and I drove down the snow-choked road, terrified and exhausted. I told myself I had seen shadows, footprints, and strange patterns in the snow because of isolation, stress, and the storm. I was wrong. Weeks later, I received a letter. No return address. Inside was a photograph of the lodge at night. The windows glowed faintly from the interior, but outside, in the snow, I could just make out the figures, tall, thin, featureless, swaying slightly as they always had. At the bottom of the photograph, written in black ink, were the words, "We never left. I never returned. I don't visit snowy forests anymore. I avoid isolation, avoid mountains in the winter. But sometimes, when I see snow falling, I feel it again. The presence, patient, waiting. I know that somewhere, beyond the trees and the frost, they still watch, and if someone foolish enough wanders into that winter, they will find them. Winter is not just cold. Winter waits, and it does not forgive." I always thought I understood winter. I grew up in upstate New York, where snowstorms could trap entire towns, where the wind sliced through your coat and made your face ache, and where the cold had a way of slowing time until everything outside felt like it belonged to another world. I never imagined winter could be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with frostbite or ice. I learned that lesson the hard way last December, when I took a job in a small town in northern Vermont. The job seemed simple: caretaker for a private lodge deep in the mountains. The lodge's owners were a retired couple from Boston who spent only a few weeks there in hunting season, leaving me with the property from November to March. The lodge sat on a hill surrounded by dense woods, a frozen lake in the back, and miles of untouched snow leading away from it. I liked solitude, or at least I thought I did, so I accepted. The first few days were quiet, almost blissfully so. I split my time between chopping wood, checking the heating systems, and clearing snow from the paths. The forest behind the lodge was beautiful, with the morning sun hitting the frost on pine needles, turning it into a glittering spectacle. But there was something unnerving about it. The way the wind moved through the trees sounded wrong, too deliberate, too like it was moving around something. I shrugged it off. I was tired from travel, I was alone. My imagination was filling in the gaps. It started subtly. On my third night, I woke to see footprints in the snow outside the kitchen window. At first I thought maybe an animal had wandered close, deer or fox, but the prints were upright, long and narrow, almost human. But something about them was off. They didn't match the stride of a human, nor the paws of an animal. They led from the woods to the window and stopped. No continuation into the forest, no marks away from the cabin, just ending. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I convinced myself it was a hunter, maybe a hiker lost in the storm. I locked the windows, double-checked the doors, and tried to sleep. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was something about the snow outside, the way it gleamed in the moonlight, that made me feel watched. Over the next few days, things escalated. I began noticing small disturbances inside the lodge, chairs slightly out of place, objects moved, and once, a long wooden broom I left against the wall was lying across the floor in the middle of the kitchen. I live alone in the city, and I've never had an issue with misplaced items. The lodge had no one else here. No logical explanation existed. By the 7th day, the storm arrived in full force. Snow piled against the windows, gusts rattled the roof, and the cold was so intense that it seeped through the walls. I stayed inside watching the woods. That night, I swore I saw shapes moving just beyond the tree line, tall, thin, swaying slightly, standing perfectly still, observing. They didn't move like humans. They didn't move like animals. I blinked, and they vanished. The following morning, the snow had shifted. More tracks appeared, the elongated prints that had haunted me earlier. They had circled the lodge, creating patterns, loops, spirals, arrangements that made no sense but felt deliberate. I could feel something intelligent behind them, something patient. I tried to leave on the 10th day. My truck wouldn't start. The battery was dead, frozen solid, and I had no cell signal to call for help. Panic began to creep in. The lodge was warm, the fire roaring, but inside, I felt cold in ways that no blanket or stove could fix. I was not alone. That night, the air in the cabin felt heavy, thick, almost alive. I could hear faint noises, movements that made no sense. A shadow passed across the wall. I spun around. Nothing. I held my breath, telling myself I was imagining it. And then I heard it. A knock at the front door. Slow. Deliberate. 3 times. No one could have come through the storm. The snow was untouched outside the main path. I didn't answer. I waited, watching the door, flashlight in hand. The knocking stopped, but then I saw handprints appear on the frost-covered window. Clear, human-like, but too large, too long. Whoever, or whatever, was out there. It had been touching the glass, staring in. I spent the rest of the night in the bedroom, under the blankets, trembling. I didn't sleep. The next day, I found new tracks. They weren't just around the lodge anymore. They stretched into the forest, deeper than I had dared to go. And in the center of the clearing behind the lodge, the snow had been disturbed. Circular depressions, shallow, arranged in a perfect ring. I had no explanation. I had no desire to investigate further. On the 12th night, I woke to the sensation of someone, or something, standing over me. Not touching, not breathing on me, but present. I opened my eyes and the room was empty, but the air felt thick, pressing down on my chest. I could feel the temperature drop, the heat draining away. My flashlight was lying on the floor by the bed, though I was certain I had left it on the dresser. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The next morning, I tried the truck again. By some miracle, it started. I drove down the mountain road, snow crunching under the tires, trees looming like silent sentinels. I told myself I was done with winter, done with isolation, done with the lodge. Weeks later, I received a letter. No return address. Inside was a photograph. The lodge at night, the windows glowing faintly. In the snow outside, I could make out the shapes. The figures I had seen, tall, thin, swaying slightly, featureless. Below the photograph, written in black ink, were the words, "We are waiting." I don't go near snow anymore. I don't hike alone, I don't travel north in December, and I never speak of what happened. But every winter, when the air turns cold and the wind whistles through the trees, I feel the presence again. I know they are still out there, waiting, patient. And I know that someday, if I am careless, they will find me. Winter is no longer quiet. It is alive. It watches. It waits. And when it finds you alone, there is no escape. Drop a like if you made it to the end.